G'day, welcome to Lunch Money. Lunch Money is your online and social media home for special situations, workouts and capital raising professionals. My name is Nick Samios. I am your Lunch Money host. I'm also the fund manager here at Hermes Capital. We're improvising with technology this morning, so we will edit out that glitch that we just had. We were doing these podcasts weekly. We're now doing them monthly. And I found that we've had some really good guests this year. We had David Gandolfo recently from Cosboa, and we've had the principal director of the Australian Institute for Credit Management recently as well. And today we are very fortunate that we have Louise Broekman, who is the chair of the Advisory Board Centre. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Louise. G'day, Louise. How you doing?
Good, Nick. Good to see you.
Very good, very good. Hopefully my little technical glitches are behind us. So, Louise, we were talking a little bit, well, we were talking a little bit about it earlier. You know, our audience is accountants and lawyers and a lot of finance brokers and restructuring professionals. And on the subject of restructuring professionals, I was at a Turnaround Management Association soiree, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago, and the guest speaker was yourself, and you were talking about advisory boards. And I've heard of advisory boards, and I've had clients who've had advisory boards, and I've seen them in particularly situations where businesses are growing, or where you've got the founder who's really good as an engineer or really good at running a fleet of trucks. But time has come where they need to level up their business. That's where I've seen a lot of it. Well, I've also seen them in startups. But tell me about yourself. Tell me about yourself and about the Advisory Board Centre.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It's good to see that you had David Gandolfo on the program too. He's
another one.
Yeah, he's another certified chair, so he's part of our advisory board professional community. But look, the Advisory Board Centre first is the global professional body for the advisory board sector. So it's about raising the standard of advisory boards. So if you're going to put one together, it's impactful. It's safe from a governance perspective, but it's also safe from an individual practitioner point of view as well. So you need to know what you're doing. So our role is to globally protect and have best practice and ethical frameworks for advisory boards. So most would be aware of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, what they do for the governance board sector. We're their counterpart, and we look after that in the advisory board space. So we're 6.5 years old. We're the only professional body in the world that's really looking and caretaking the advisory board sector.
So there's quite a story behind. Behind the Advisory Board Centre in itself. I mean, so you say you've been going 6.5 years, but you've already got global reach. Is that right?
Yeah, we operate in over 25 countries now. I just got back this week from delivering our best practice framework and programs in Singapore, London, New York, and Los Angeles. So without any jet lag, it's just been fantastic seeing the global response to advisory boards as it just continues to be used in so many new ways. Because in some ways, governance boards are so constrained, advisory boards are being used more and more in the business sector, startup scale-ups, certainly in the mid-market, but also in corporatized environments as well.
I mean, it's fascinating that what you're providing isn't like, you're presenting in New York, so there's a demand for this stuff. I mean, that's just amazing. It really is, and it's a real credit to you as well. So I understand that in a former role you had an advisory board yourself. You had a business, a HR coaching business.
That's right.
And you had that for about 12 years. So that's where you sort of came across the advisory board concept.
Yeah, well, we had a terrific business and we wanted to grow it globally. And I wanted to make really confident decisions, not only as a business owner, but as a CEO. And I just felt that making ad hoc decisions was not good enough. So I decided to put together an advisory board to support me with my thinking. So I didn't go and change my mind. And so that was in 2005. And then from that, we grew that business to 135 offices in 8 countries in that 5-year period. So I was just very grateful, Nick, for what the advisory board had done for me personally, as well as for the business. But because I came from a research and development and intellectual property background, I decided to invest 5 years researching, testing, validating advisory boards in the market. And that's when we found there's no professional body looking after it. And so that's where 6.5 years ago, we launched the model of being the professional body to caretake the sector.
So has it gone from being sort of a something that's, it's obviously a good idea, but there was no like formal structure around it, to something that you've identified a need. The other interesting thing is, did you say 25 countries you expanded your business to? I mean, that's remarkable.
Yeah, currently we're in 25 countries. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. But for your own business, so that you had someone on the advisory board who was able to, who had experience, taking your business international, or?
Well, yes, one of them. So when you put together an advisory board, you want them all to be different, add different value. So I chose entrepreneurs that I deeply admired and respected, so that they weren't there actually to build the strategy. And it wasn't because we had capability gaps. What we wanted to do is actually build our confidence in the decision making, so we could road test our thinking, pull it apart, for them to evaluate it and to really test my own thinking, so that we became very deliberate in the way that we made those decisions.
So you're not in sort of a one-person echo chamber, I suppose.
Exactly. And when you look at, where advisory boards are today, the Reserve Bank of Australia just a few weeks back, with the latest report, the Monetary Policy Board is putting together an advisory board, so they don't have that echo chamber, they don't have that group think, and they're bringing the outside in. It's nothing new. It just demonstrates the absolute power of critical thinking and independent thinking that sits around the value of an advisory board.
Now tell me, so you already mentioned that, the way you started off your advisory board. I mean, what's the difference between an informal advisory board and a formalised, structured professional one that your members get involved with?
Yeah, it's important to know the difference between that, as well as the difference with the governance board at the other end. So I might look at that. So a governance board first is a decision-making model, and it's binding. It's binding on the individual directors, where you can go to jail for the decisions that you make or not make, but it's also binding on the organisation to implement based on those decisions. So advisory boards in general are not a decision-making model. They're a problem-solving model, so it's not binding. So you've actually got safety in having this non-binding conversation that enables you to have the freedom to really explore different concepts without the decision having to actually be made in that same forum. Advisory boards do take different shapes and forms, and informal advisory boards is when generally you'll see traditionally that business owners will put together their own advisory board. They chair it themselves. They don't pay people. They put on people that are friendly, that they know. They may be their immediate providers that are around them, but they kind of fizzle out over time because there's just no formal structure around it. A formal best practice advisory board is when you have a charter, you have really clear parameters about what the advisory board is there to talk about, what it's not there to talk about. And the advisors are chosen fit for purpose. Generally, they meet 4 to 6 times a year, and you measure impact on an annual basis. When you get that level of clarity around what the advisory board is, it's deeply impactful because it is so focused.
So I mentioned that I met you at a Turnaround Management Association function. So obviously, one of the times an SME might engage an advisory board is when they're going through a rough patch and they really need someone to help them save the business and get it back on the right footing. I mean, what are when are the sort of major triggers for someone engaging an advisory board?
Yeah, there are different advisory boards for different reasons and also different seasons. So about 29% of the market is for emerging businesses when they are trying to get through the valley of death, and they actually get them into being cash flow positive and to the next stage. Growing businesses is the largest market for advisory boards. So 75% of businesses, when they establish advisory board, is because they want to grow, but they need to navigate how to grow. But the businesses that are changing and actually focusing on a transition is a very tricky time. So when they're trying to evaluate what's next in their business is a very important stage for advisory boards. And we find certain businesses at different sizes, like $1.5 million in revenue turnover, 10 million, 30 million, 50 million, and 100 million. They have very common starting points by revenue because they're trying to think through what's our business model for what's next, because it's going to be different.
So it's almost like there's milestone levels of the business to some extent, is what you're saying. Yeah, when you've got to make that journey across the border. I mean, we'll talk in a minute about, because I know that you've just issued a report on the state of the market for advisory boards. But just before we dive into that, I mean, you know, I've had friends. I'm thinking of a law firm and a large finance brokerage where they haven't had advisory boards, but they've been part of networking groups, you know, the Executive Connection, this sort of thing, where I don't know whether or not they sort of informally cobbling something together, or they're running a formal structure, as you're discussing. But I mean, what are the best practices? I mean, what are the key principles for a successful advisory board?
Yeah, so a lot of businesses that are in peer advisory boards, like Tech, CEO Institute, all those different groups, they'll be part of those groups, but then they'll also have their own individual advisory board around all of their business or for a project in their business. But the key principles is ensuring you've got clarity of scope, you've got structure and discipline, that you're measuring impact, that advisory board members are independent of the organisation, but also then independent of each other. And I think this whole value and values of independence and ethics that sit around that is going to increasingly become important. And then you've got fit for purpose, so making sure that those advisors are the right people around that table to have that right conversation. So they are the key principles of putting an advisory board together. It's not about adding more complexity. Actually, the simpler the model, the better. But it's about being rigorous in the way that you think about the constructs of how it's going to work.
I mean, when there must be cases where advisory boards have gone wrong. I mean, what's the main thing when someone says to you, "Look, we did this and it just didn't work out"? What are the main suspects, or the main causes that you find?
The interesting thing around turnaround situations, Nick, is that the timing of an advisory board is really important. So if the business is going through a cash flow crisis, as an example, they need to resolve that first. An advisory board is more of a longer term play normally, or it's a project advisory board specifically for a need, like a business managing an exit will generally have an advisory board for 18 months to maximise the asset value for that exit. And so advisory boards have been brought in too late, when it's already a cash flow issue or cash flow crisis. Is the biggest constraint around advisory boards is when there's a crisis.
Turnaround management 101, the thing that everybody laments is, you should have got me involved 12 months ago, 6 months ago.
Yeah.
It's no good. Otherwise you're turning up after the accident's happened, and
Exactly.
it's too late. So it sounds like, and I guess this is one of the things that Safe Harbour was designed to try and get people to try and do something about their problems. You don't have to sort of show your dirty laundry to the whole world. And I guess so advisory boards, like anything else, you're encouraging people to do it sooner rather than later. So tell me, you've done this state of the market report. You've got a few slides for us. Do you want to step us through that? Let me bring those up for you.
I'll just do some of the highlights, Nick, and I might just ask some questions of you along the way as well, because
sure.
I'd be very interested in your perspective as well. So this report we produce every 2 years, and we just released it about 6 weeks ago. There's a lot of different data points that we have in the way that we collect the data. What are some of the key triggers is that our last market report, which was released in 2021, has been referenced by both Korn Ferry and Financial Times as being the hot new governance trend in the market, being advisory boards. I'm not sure if it is, but if they say that, I'm gonna take ownership of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the market is shifting in the advisory boards, and when we're looking at directors themselves, they generally have a lot of concerns. I'm interested in your views, Nick, about what you see. What are some of the biggest concerns for directors at the moment?
Look, I deal in a specific space, I suppose. So, we tend to do a lot in the, where there is turnaround, and, they're obviously, they're all in on the business, and they're worried about their own personal risk. So that's the main thing that I see them concerned about. What am I concerned about for them sometimes is I see a business and, we're providing funding, and we're only providing funding. We're not advisors. We're just the guys that put the money in. But you see them, you're only, you've grown the business. And a friend of mine has a saying, tradie done good. You've gone from being one person with a ute, and now you've grown the business to this size. And do you really have the skills? And sometimes you see the strain on the staff and the strain on the accountant, and so that's what I see.
It is really tricky. And look, when you look at the advisory board sector, it goes from startups to scale ups, the mid market, to organisations. But when you've got business owners who are directors and owners, they've got a incredible pressure to not only operate the business but also to manage their own responsibility as a director. And the problem with directorship at the moment is that it's what we call the governance dilemma, is that there's increased constraint for directors, and the agenda is just getting bigger. There's so many more things you've got to consider as a director, and it's just not sustainable when we look at board directors as well as owner directors. How do you cover off on everything? So what do? Bring on extra directors, bring on extra managers, have longer meetings, just wing it. Or bring in an advisory board that creates this thinking system to put quality thinking in before decisions are being made. And this is kind of where this is a new trigger in the market today. The other part of that is that what's happening then is that we're just not talking about governance boards anymore. We're talking about governance systems. So advisory boards actually have a new role to play beyond their traditional role, is to supporting directors making more effective and confident decisions. So directors don't go to jail because of the decision they made as being good or bad. They go to jail because they haven't shown good due process in the way the decision is made. And this is where advisory boards create this thinking system and problem solving before decisions are made. And I think this is a really important shift in the market that's happening right now. And it's also giving greater flexibility into how advisory boards operate, where advisory boards, as you mentioned earlier, start from informal peer advisory boards like tech, the different kind of those kind of advisory groups. But then businesses, when they say, look, I want to start building an advisory board, but I can't just go from nothing to best practice overnight. And so they're building advisory boards from starting from it being an advisory board of one and building it up into pop-up advisory boards and project advisory boards, and then growing into their advisory board structure over time. And I think this is a really practical approach, particularly where the business market, that $1.5 to $100 million turnover businesses, are really using advisory boards in a very practical way. And when we look at that mid-market, the average size of a business starting an advisory board is their revenue turnover is between $1 to $1.5 million in revenue, which you might consider that's pretty small. And I think that's a great sign that businesses are starting their advisory board structures early on and growing up with getting quality advice, with the average size of a business being 20 million.
Can I ask you a question? So one of the problems that you face with small business where you know they need help and they need an advisor of some description. Maybe they need a consultant. You can identify, look, you need a consultant, or for that matter, you need an advisory board. But when they're at that 1.5 million turnover, it might be different when they're 20 or 30 or 40. But when they're at that small level, the first thing they say is, look, I just can't afford it. Now, of course, the natural response to that is, well, you can't afford not to. But what are some of the costs that a small business at that 1 to 1.5 level might face?
Yeah, so it depends on what structure it is that they want to put in place. But most advisory board professionals will charge between $2,000 to $3,500 for half a day. And generally, a chair will work for half a day a month for up to 3 years. So the investment could be around $40,000 to $70,000 in their first year, which is cheaper than an administrator. And so you think about, get this right, get the right people talking about the right things with you. Like it's got to be seen as an investment. I've since my first advisory board, I've always had one. Even pre-revenue, I've had an advisory board to make sure that I am thinking bigger than myself, which is why it is so valuable. But it's got to be seen as an investment, Nick. I think, not just as an operating expense. But most businesses will have an independent chair and 2 external advisors. So that way you've got the power of 3, which we know that creates optimal decision making when you've got
three people on the advisory board at that
3
level.
independent sources.
Yeah. Okay.
But they might start with their chair first as an advisory board of 1, then bring in advisors as they need them, and then build it up over time. There's many ways to do it that can really fit the season that the business is going through at that time.
All right. Well, let's keep moving through the state of the market, because I'm just jotting down some questions to ask you about later.
So from a practical point of view, where the market is now is project advisory boards. So 53% of advisory boards and new advisory boards today are project advisory boards, which means that it's really, really practical. So it's not about the strategy, it's more about a strategy. So it may be around an advisory board to enter a new market, commercialization of a new idea, sustainability, evaluating the supply chain. Customer advisory boards is just such a smart strategy to co-create your product and your service with the customer. This is where the market is right now, and I think this is the most commercially smart information that we've got about what's going on in the market about advisory boards, and I'm very excited to see that advisory boards are actually being used in that way.
Just before you go off that slide, you've got there's so with these project advisory boards, there's a start point and an end point. And there's a very clear start point and an end point, I suppose.
It could be 90 days.
It could be 90 days. I mean, I always make a joke about breaking up with your physio, because you go to the physio and you know that you've got something, but of course, at some point they want you to keep coming back. So it's good to have that predefined endpoint. So I guess, but with these project advisory boards, there's a beginning and an end.
Job is done, dismantle it. It's not a fixed structure, and you don't want to put that kind of constraint on it anyway. But even for an all of business advisory board that's ongoing, you want to evaluate it every year to see, is it actually providing value, giving return on investment, and are those advisors still the right advisors for us for what we've got to do next? And so everyone that sits on an advisory board needs to understand they have a use-by date. If you still need the same advisors 3 years after you've set one up, I think that's a problem.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But when we look at where businesses are focusing in the next 18 months, Nick, I'm interested in your views. Where do you see businesses focusing on in the current market?
Look, firstly, all of my predictions are wrong. So that's the first thing you got to take. I think the big 2 challenges, I reckon from the top of my head is, it's economic, obviously. Where is the economy going? The indicators right now are pretty strong. The unemployment's low, and there's plenty of growth. On the other hand, interest rates are going up. You mentioned the Reserve Bank of Australia before. I mean, they've made some very bad predictions. That's for sure. To say that rates won't go. So there's that, and the other thing is that maybe you're a bit smarter than I am, but this time last year, I knew absolutely nothing about AI. And, now it's kind of entered the lexicon. So I think that technology just moving so fast as it is, and just economic uncertainty, I think they're the big things.
Yeah, yeah. So when we're looking at the data about when businesses have an advisory board, generally you're getting businesses viewing the same things as an opportunity as other businesses are viewing it as a challenge. So it's all around, how do we transition to what's next? How do we manage our people? And what's our governance and structure moving forward? They are the three big ticket items that advisory boards are focusing on right now. And when we look at what that actually means from when we cluster that information, it's about from an opportunity lens, how do organisations and businesses actually embrace change? So how
Can I ask you, you mentioned that word governance before, and
Yeah.
maybe that sort of ties into this as well. I mean, what do you mean by governance? Because governance to me, it can mean obviously the decision-making processes and the governance as we would traditionally know it, and then there's governance in terms of it's almost compliance, complying with a whole bunch of societal values to some extent as well. This ESG and what have you. So, what do you mean by governance?
Yeah, it embraces all of those things, Nick. But I think governance is more complex now, because when we're dealing with increased constraint, but then also the market expectations of what we call the stakeholder economy. And so making decisions in a bubble is probably not where the market is going in the future. And I think where we talk about advisory boards being the hot new governance trend in 2025, I think the market will be talking about advisory boards being the next leadership trend. For leaders making decisions without stakeholder engagement, I think the way that we manage business, we will need to demonstrate and ensure that we are thinking bigger about the way that we're making decisions.
Well, you just said the stakeholder economy. So what does that mean?
So we're looking at the way that we manage expectations of different stakeholders, and every organisation has stakeholders. It could be employees, could be investment, could be your suppliers, could be your clients, it could be the market at large. Certainly, customers is one of the biggest areas, and so any business that has a vulnerable customer, I think, has a real opportunity to really embrace and support their customer in their business. So you look at the aged care industry as an example. I'm not sure if you're doing any work in that market, Nick, but the aged care sector have now been regulated that they have to have advisory boards to listen to their customer. They're called customer advisory boards. By the 1st of December, they need to comply with this new regulation. It's the first time in Australia that advisory boards are being regulated in a particular sector. This is game-changing, so we can't ignore it. If any business in Australia that's doing business in Europe, they need to be able to not only have quality reporting around sustainability, but they need to also back it up in the way that they operate around sustainability.
So what you're saying is there's a need, obviously, for helping the business transition and make good decisions and operate and work as a business. But to some extent, there's also a protection factor as well to make sure that you're complying, as you said, with these customer imperatives. But to use that term, the stakeholder economy, so that has something shifted? That I mean, have we always had a stakeholder economy, or is this something new?
Well, it's certainly a term that I've really seen. It's a term that I used in the State of the Market report, that we see advisory boards being used in the market everywhere. So the market for advisory boards now is wide and it's deep. So it's no longer about an argument about saying, should I have an advisory board? Is how am I maximising the value of my advisory board for my business? And when we're looking at social, political, the whole pestle model, technology,
Yeah.
as you mentioned,
Yeah.
AI,
Yeah.
no one is an expert anymore. And so 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with a hydrogen specialist for a private equity group in London, and he was employed as the specialist in hydrogen. He says, I needed an advisory board because even though I'm a specialist in hydrogen, I can't call myself an expert anymore because everything is moving too fast. And so for me to inform the investment strategies that we're doing just based on my experience, that's just potentially reckless. And so having different thinking and that sits around it will just help to have confidence in the final decision that's being made. But it also for individuals protecting, and it's terrible, it's not just about accountability, um, uh, system accountability, but it's also about impact accountability as well. So it has to go beyond process, and it needs to be effective in the way that we do engage with the market, whoever the stakeholder is.
Okay. Have you got more slides or?
Yes. So let me just quickly have a look. The advisory board sector itself this is not a fad. So the advisory board sector has actually grown over 50% since 2019, and just 20%.
You must really be in demand. Yeah, I mean, you must be getting phone calls in the middle of the night and all sorts. I would have thought.
Yeah, the days are long, Nick.
Yeah.
Because it's a global thing, and advisory boards, certainly from an Australia point of view, if we're looking at global trends, the Asian market has doubled in their usage of advisory boards in the last 2 years, and the Middle East is now 2% of the market, which is probably still a small number, but it wasn't represented at all 2 years ago. So it's there's a need for this. Sorry, and we talked about best practice already, so I guess that's the end of
Yeah.
what
Okay.
I need to say.
All right. Well, look, just a couple of things then. I was talking to Daniela, who was one of our guests a couple of episodes ago, and we were talking about, she was just talking about her own career, and she was saying, she was thinking of doing the AICD, and I said, look, you make sure you tune in today. So I hope Daniela's watching today, because I said to her, look, I think that this advisory board thing is a little bit more hands-on in terms of a little bit more down to earth, etc. But is there a career in being an advisory board member? Like, people join the AICD and they do, and I don't want to set up any tension or between the two bodies, but they sort of see themselves as they get a few grey hairs as maybe having a career as a director. Is being an advisory board chair or an advisory board member a career?
Absolutely. But most people, when they look at their career on boards, so we'll just talk about boards in general, will generally have 5 to 6 gigs on at any given time. That's when you're doing it full time, that's what you do. And it's not a thing about either or, it can be and. It's about understanding what is my risk profile, and really making very careful decisions, because if you're going to sit on a governance board, you've got everything on the line. So you want to make sure you do your due diligence on that. Doesn't mean that you don't do your due diligence on an advisory board, but it's different. Governance boards are there to make decisions, and it's a serious undertaking, and absolutely rightly so. An advisory board is a problem-solving model, so it's a different conversation. It's a different construct. So if you're wanting to be involved in conversations about what are the decisions that we need to make about the future? What are the options? How do we make it safe to think differently, to have diversity, not in diversity with regards to gender, but diversity in the conversation? And so if we're going to make different decisions, we have to have a safe ground to be able to have those kinds of conversations. Advisory boards is the ideal space for anyone that wants to contribute to a different future. And I think everyone wants to be a positive impact on that. That's where advisory boards are adding value.
And you obviously have a certification program. So I can't remember the terminology now. Is it certified chair or a...
Yeah, the certified chair executive program, and there's a credential and there's a unique identification number as well that you have. And so it's all about raising the standard of advisory boards, because you're thinking about, if you're going to do it well, make sure it's impactful, make sure it's safe. Not only safe for the organisation, but also safe for you professionally. If you are, and we carefully select, it's by invitation only. We select less than 10% of those that apply, and then they do the credential.
Right.
That you have worked so hard, all of us have worked so hard to build our knowledge and expertise. If you're going to sit on advisory boards, don't wing it. Do it well. Make sure that you've got their best practice in place. So it's something that you're really proud of, but also something that is safe from a risk management perspective for the organisation, but then also for yourself, especially when you're dealing with advisory boards within ecosystems of governance, supporting business owners who are making different decisions about the future, which is challenging, but also these advisory boards in large organisations. All of this matters.
And so, what do you think the future? What do you think the future is for advisory boards? Just it sounds like their remit is expanding to some extent. I guess you're saying that you mentioned the healthcare sector or the aged care sector, where advisory boards are effectively being mandated, is what you're saying. And that's a formal mandate. I mean, I just wonder if to some extent there's also informal mandates as well in terms of best practice and.
Yeah. So I think when we're looking at regulations, I hope overall that the advisory board sector is not regulated for advisory boards the way that governance boards are, because its flexibility is its strength. But there are going to be certain markets where advisory boards are going to be really important in their role around the vulnerable customer, like aged care. So probably disability services will be the next one, childcare, education, banking sector, the energy sector, anywhere where there's a vulnerable customer, advisory boards have got this new role to play. But just broadly, I think every organisation, both at a board level as well as executives, we need to be thinking about how are we making decisions and how well informed are we? Are we making decisions in a bubble? Do we have a mechanism to bring the outside in? And this is where the market, I think, is absolutely going long term.
With my day job, I'm involved in capital raising, so debt capital raising, and as they're usually exclusively transitional situations, whether it's a turnaround, a merger and acquisition. How do I? And I've said to you before, I can see, look, they've built a great business, but they've run out of skills. They're fighting with bows and arrows, and the enemy's got machine guns, and they need to level up. How do I introduce the subject? I mean, what's the conversation that I should be having with those business owners and directors?
Well, firstly, Nick, we've got a service called the Advisor Concierge, and it's free. So when a business doesn't know what they need or who they need, they can come to us. We provide a free service with regards to evaluating what their priorities are, what are the different advisory structures that might be relevant to them, and if they go ahead, then they can connect into the advisory board community, the professional community, and then select their advisory board members. That's a totally free service. We don't take percentage fees, rebates, or any kickbacks out of any of those arrangements. So
just briefly step me through that. I pick up the phone.
Yep, we'll set up a meeting.
Yep. So
you can sit in on that meeting if you like, as the service provider.
Sure.
Or you can just say you look after them, and then we help them evaluate what their priorities are and what are the different options that they have with regards to their advisory structure that could work for them to be able to address what they're trying to do.
So it's like, look, you should reach out to the advisory board concierge. They'll have a chat to you over the phone. They'll ask to get together with you. I'll come along if you want someone to hold your hand, but and then they'll tell you what the possibilities are and what the suitability of an advisory board and what it might be able to help you step through, etc.
Or
over
not.
to you. Or not. Yeah.
An advisory board may not be right for them, so that's where it's really important to have that I guess buffer zone before they start going out to talking with people. Actually getting clarity around what are our expectations in the first place. Invest time in that to get that right before you start actually connecting in with people.
Well, now the next question that I have is, someone might be a finance broker or an accountant or whoever. says to me, listen, I've been asked to join this advisory board, what should I do?
Yeah, get them to come and talk to us and make sure that if they sit on that advisory board, they get credentialed.
Right.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah. And I guess the same thing might be where they say, look, I've got a client or whatever, and they don't have an advisory board. They just asked me to start one up or to help them. Same thing again, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. So our chair certification provides professionals with best practice frameworks on how to establish an advisory board. Generally, it takes 3 months to establish an advisory board. There's a lot that goes into it to make sure you've got the right purpose, the right process, and then finally the right people. Normally, when people think about an advisory board, they go straight to who am I going to get on that advisory board? There's a lot of thinking around the purpose and the structure first, and then they're getting the right voices around the table is the third piece.
Now, I'll just ask you one more question, and just one moment here. I've just realized, again, I think I said to you that that my computer died literally maybe 20 minutes before we were going to go live. So I see that I'm just having a look to see if we've got some questions here. Andy Way, let's see what Andy says. Andy Way says, advisory boards need regulation or they operate with authority without responsibility. What do you say to that?
Well, the regulation that's happening in the aged care sector, it's really interesting saying mandating you have to have an advisory board. There's actually no there's no guidance on the how to. And this is where self-regulation is the role, Andrew, that we've had to take, because there isn't anything that's existed until we've done that. So this self-regulation around process accountability and impact accountability, I think it's really important. So this role that we take on now for self-regulation, you're right, it's really important that this sector, as it continues to grow, that it does it well. We're getting a lot of people entering the advisory board space that do not know what they're doing, and I think that's problematic. It's a great opportunity that the sector's growing, but it's also problematic.
No, that's very interesting. It's a great observation, Andrew. Thank you very much. It's interesting because we mentioned David Gandolfo before. I mean, David wears many hats, but one of his hats, I think he's now in advisory capacity to the Commercial Asset Finance Brokers Association. But one of the things that David's and the other good folk at CAFPA have always been concerned about is getting ahead of the regulation curve, if you like, to be able to demonstrate, listen, we're self-regulating, we're a professional body, we're making sure that, certain standards are being met, and therefore, government, you don't need to come in and tread on us. Because we're doing this ourselves. So I guess there's an element of that as well. That's what you're saying.
That's right. And it was a great point with David, and don't like talking about someone who's not here, but he's a very important part of our best practice advisory board community. He came and spoke with me at our summit 2 months ago about the role of advisory boards while they work with governance boards, and it needs to be very carefully considered and mapped out to make sure it is effective.
Right. And the last thing I was going to ask you, and I know you haven't answered this question because I've heard you answer it before, but I think you've mentioned something like $2,000 to $3,500 for half a day or something, and that's nice. I'll be able to take my wife out to a very nice dinner for that kind of money, maybe somewhere interstate, who knows? But it's not going to compensate me for when I lose my house for being a shadow director. So I know that you do have it's a protection mechanism so that I can join an advisory board without necessarily risking house and home.
Yeah, so everyone needs to be mindful of their own behaviour, right? We can't save people from themselves.
Right. Yes, that's true.
But advisory boards, certainly when they're not decision makers, is really important. So there are certain things that really need to be considered to ensure that you don't move into that space of being a shadow director, about having a very clear charter, having a chair that absolutely knows what they're doing, to have very carefully considered minutes to demonstrate that they're not actually in a decision-making cycle, to ensure that, simple things that seem like it's an obvious thing to do that I can sit on an advisory board and be a consultant at the same time. As soon as you start taking on multiple roles, your risk profile starts to change.
Yeah.
And so the closer you are, the deeper you become, the more problematic it becomes, especially when you take on a role of being maybe an advisory board member and an investor, and you're meeting 10 times a year. You'd be hard pressed to say I'm not actually part of a decision-making cycle.
But you do help your members with guardrails,
Yeah,
if you
absolutely.
like, around all that.
Yeah.
Louise, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much. There you go. We've gone for 45 minutes, and I'm sure we could go for another 45 minutes. I think it's a fascinating area, and as I say, a lot of our audience, as it's been proven. I mean, it was funny. I got an SMS from David going, "Oh, Louise, I was just on a panel." It's like one of those things. Once you hear the term, all of a sudden they're everywhere. And I think it's important that people providing advice, whether it be financial or legal or accounting, to small businesses are right across this advisory board space. So thank you very much for speaking with us. We're going to put some links in all the socials when we promote the clips and what have you. So if you're watching this in 2 weeks' time, just have a look and you'll find a link to the Advisory Board Centre. And it's great. Thank you very much, Louise. We'll wrap it up.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. And thanks to our audience for listening and watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're on Apple, give us a 5-star rating. That'd be nice. Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.